shortly.
Order. Munira Wilson to move the motion.
I beg to move that this House has considered tutoring provision, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today, Mrs Cummins. I'd also like to thank the Backbench Business Committee for granting this debate and members from all sides of the House who supported my application. Unfortunately, we're clashing today with the Education Select Committee, whose chair and a number of members were very supportive of this debate. The debate today is about the government's national tutoring programme and the 16 to 19 tuition fund, which will end at the end of this academic year. Now, I was really disappointed, and I know other members from all sides of the House were disappointed, that there was no new money announced in the budget to allow this scheme to continue. As a result, schools and colleges have two options. They can try to fund the scheme from their own meagre budgets, something almost all will find it hard to achieve given the cuts they're already having to make, or they can scrap it altogether. And that would be a travesty. During the pandemic, children were, in quotes, at the back of the queue and always overlooked. They're not my words, those are the words of Anne Longfield, who was the Children's Commissioner during COVID. Despite the remarkable efforts of our teachers and education leaders, who heroically adapted their lessons for online learning, we lost tens of millions of hours of valuable classroom time. And we know that disadvantaged children were most impacted. Now, Sir Kevin Collins, the government's own advisor, acknowledged that children needed £15 billion to bridge the educational gap during the pandemic, created by the pandemic, I should say. When he was given just a fraction of that, he promptly resigned. In an interview he recently gave to TES magazine, he recognised the value of tutoring and said he had wanted to dramatically scale it up so that 5 million pupils had received tutoring by the end of 2024. He was also clear that tutoring should be best managed and led by schools, saying that schools know their children best. I couldn't agree more. But as we all know, the recovery programme that Sir Kevin called for was just not delivered. Now, I have to be totally honest, and this won't probably surprise you, I was not always a fan of how the government's national tutoring programme was implemented. We know it encountered numerous challenges, from ineffective outsourcing, tortuous application processes, tutoring shortages, and dare I mention the word Randstad. Even the Education Select Committee, under the chairmanship of the Right Honourable Member for Harlow, who's obviously now a minister in the Department for Education, recognised in a report in 2022 that a complex bureaucratic system for applications may have hampered some schools' ability to access tutoring, and teachers and staff and school staff know their pupils and know what interventions are likely to bring the most benefit. And, as identified by Sir Kevin Collins himself, the tutoring programme fell drastically short of the size that it should have been. But despite all of its failings, it did manage to achieve some positive outcomes. Tutoring, when implemented correctly, has proved its worth time and time again. It has helped catch up lost learning, and it has shown many additional benefits, such as improved confidence and school attendance. Now, in the run-up to the budget, more than 500 schools signed a letter to the Prime Minister, the Secretary of State for Education and the Chancellor, calling for more national tutoring programme funding. The letter was delivered to Number 10 by Action Tutoring, Tutor Trust and Get Further representatives, who have all done amazing work in this area. I pay tribute to their work, and several of them are here today in the gallery watching this debate. Now, the government's response to that call was that it will continue to support tutoring through pupil premium funding. School leaders will be dismayed by this response. Established by the Liberal Democrats in government, pupil premium was once a fund to support disadvantaged children. But since 2015, the value of the pupil premium eroded by 14% in real terms, according to the IFS. And I think we can all acknowledge that in recent years, it is more often used to plug gaps in school funding. Something the Honourable Member for Worcester recognised himself when he said, "I'm not sure there is sufficient space in the pupil premium to support tutoring becoming part of the system." So Mrs. Cummings, why am I such a fan of tutoring? We are lucky. So much research has been done about the impact of tutoring. The Sutton Trust Public First Education Endowment Foundation and others have all looked at tutoring. This government claims it is led by evidence. So let us look at some. The Sutton Trust says that the attainment gap, which had been gradually decreasing throughout the early 2010s, stalled in the years before the pandemic. And since the crisis, the gap has widened considerably. 10 years of progress has now been wiped out. They believe that tutoring is a key method of boosting learning for disadvantaged children. And they say the programme has had a considerable impact on levelling out access to tutoring, with 35% of working class Year 11 students receiving private or school-based tutoring, compared to 36% of students from professional homes. Work by the Education Endowment Foundation has shown the effectiveness of tutoring, showing an average impact of 4 months additional progress over the course of a year with small group tutoring. They also recognise the particular benefits tutoring can bring to disadvantaged children. They said, studies in England have shown that pupils eligible for free school meals typically receive additional benefits from small group tuition. And that stands to reason. Allowing a teacher to focus on the needs of a small number of learners and provide teaching that is closely matched to that pupil's individual understanding is, of course, going to reap greater rewards than teaching a larger number of students. Small groups offer the opportunity for greater levels of interaction and feedback compared to whole class teaching. Let's take the example of Dylan. Dylan is a typical student who has benefited from tutoring through an action tutoring tutor. Dylan struggled with maths and was considered unlikely to meet the expected standard. His school set him up with tutoring. He attended 16 sessions over a period of 2 years. The result? He moved from a grade 3 to obtaining a grade 4 pass, but the benefits were so much more than just getting the grade that he needed. Dylan said, "Before I started my tutoring sessions, I dreaded maths because I just didn't enjoy it. But my tutoring sessions were amazing and really helped boost my confidence in maths. When I found out I passed my maths GCSE, I didn't believe it. Dead serious. I literally was flabbergasted. I was like, what is even going on? I looked at it twice as I was just so flustered." Mrs. Cummings, that hope and excitement expressed by Dylan, that promise of being able to move on to the next stage of your life and pursue your dreams is absolutely priceless. Public First research shows that the impact of tutoring has had on GCSE pass rates and overall grades in key subjects. 62,000 additional pass grades in GCSE Maths and English were achieved due to government-funded tutoring in 2021-22 and 2022-23 academic years. But tutoring is an intervention which impacts pupils right across the grade spectrum, providing 430,000 grade improvements in total, with 220,000 in Maths and 210,000 in English. The long-term economic impact of this in terms of earning potential is significant. So too is the very real impact that strong foundations in numeracy and literacy have on people's lives. Now, we all know that under 18s in England have to retake GCSE English and Maths if they did not achieve a grade 4 pass. This resulted in a staggering 167,000 students having to retake Maths and 172,000 resitting English in 2023. Combined, that is the highest number of retakes in a decade. And yet we are setting these children up for repeated failure unless different help and support is provided. Just 16.4% of students resitting GCSE Maths in England passed with at least a grade 4 this year, and the pass rate for English is only slightly higher. This group of children need targeted help and support. Time with a tutor in small group sessions to get to the bottom of what they find difficult, with personal, structured work plans to help boost progress. Targeted tutoring has been exceptionally effective at helping this particular group, and I was lucky enough to see the work of Get Further when I visited Southwark College last year. Sitting in on a few sessions allowed me to see tutoring firsthand and it was fascinating to see the way that tutors were able to engage one-on-one with pupils, helping them unpack a maths question or discussing the meaning of a particular word in English. The children I spoke to all had aspirations and plans for the future and really valued the time with teachers that they were able to spend with teachers on a one-on-one or small group basis. Aidan at London's South East colleges had missed out on a grade 4 English GCSE twice. He was supported by a Get Further tutor who helped him to understand things for the first time in a tailored small group and one-to-one setting. He says this about his experience. I was only aiming for a 4, as it was my 3rd time retaking English, and I wanted to get it over and done with. As I continued my tuition, I started to understand things I didn't understand before and quickly improved. Now, I have a 6, and it's all thanks to my tutor. I am so pleased with the grade I achieved and proud of how far I have come. In September, I aim to go on to Level 2 Health and Social Care and then move on to Level 3 or an Access to Higher Education course so that I can do paramedic science at university with awesome classmates who share what I aspire to be, someone who helps people at their highest and their lowest moments. Tutoring can be truly transformational. We should also acknowledge that many other spillover benefits that tutoring brings. These speak to many current concerns in our education system. 85% of parents said tutoring had positively impacted their child's confidence, with 68% saying it had improved attendance. Coach Bright has recently published its impact report and has done some really interesting work on the relationship between tutoring and attendance. Their results show that tutoring can reduce persistent absence by 11%. At a time when we know thousands of pupils are missing from school, tutoring can offer the opportunity of a new trusted adult in the lives of children and young people and gives them a new way to engage with their education. And the bottom line? Well, for every £1 spent on tutoring, £6.58 in economic returns is generated. That is a direct result of pupils achieving higher grades and having higher lifetime earnings potential. So the benefits are felt not just by those receiving the tutoring, they benefit our whole economy and our whole society. So, Mrs. Cummings, the evidence is compelling, but there's also a strong political case for continuing tutoring too. Tutoring is popular. In its research, Public First found that pupils like tutoring. Students were positive about their experiences and were willing to have more of it if it was available. Parents like tutoring. Over 3/4 of parents would support increased tutoring provision. And teachers like tutoring. They welcomed the impact on both academic attainment and wider benefits such as pupil confidence, increased engagement in the classroom, and reduced anxiety. A policy that is popular with pupils, with parents, and with teachers. I have no wish to help this government, but surely that sounds like it might be a vote winner. So, Liberal Democrats believe in tutoring. That's why we have said we would offer a tutoring guarantee for every disadvantaged pupil who needs extra support, recognising that tutoring is most effective when we allow head teachers and college leaders to decide themselves how to run the scheme. Indeed, I think that tutoring is so important that I joined with the Conservative chair of the Education Select Committee, the Honourable Member for Worcester, and the Noble Lord Blunkett, a Labour peer and former Education Secretary, to try to convince the government to maintain funding for the tutoring programme beyond the end of this academic year. As we've heard from some of the case studies, tutoring and tuition can be a life-changing intervention. Those of us who are parents, who are privileged enough to be able to afford tutoring for our children, we don't hesitate to pay for it in order to boost their attainment and their confidence. In the words of Lorraine Spence, whose daughter Naomi benefited from Get Further's tutoring after she failed her maths GCSE, she says, "My daughter is now thriving at university, but without the extension of this kind of funding, countless young people from low-income families will miss out on securing the gateway qualifications they need to unlock opportunities like this. Should tutoring return to being a luxury for the rich and a sacrifice for the poor? I urge the government not to allow this to be the case. Instead, let's make a more equitable educational system where tutoring is accessible to all and one positive legacy to come out of the pandemic." I couldn't agree with Lorraine's words more. So if the government is serious about levelling up, then I hope the Minister will make a commitment today that he is willing to do battle with his colleagues in the Treasury to ensure funding for both the National Tutoring Programme and the 16 to 19 Tuition Fund will continue. Schools and colleges need that assurance urgently to be able to plan for the next academic year. Thank you.
The question is that this House is considered tutoring provision. Paul Howell.
Thank you, Mrs. Collins. It's a pleasure, as always, to serve under your chair. And I must, of course, start with thanking the member for Twickenham for securing this important debate. I'd just like to speak today a few words in support of the Government's National Tutoring Programme, which has been an outstanding initiative that provided invaluable support for children whose education was impacted, particularly during the global coronavirus pandemic. I also would like to share my first-hand experience of it. As the Member of Parliament for Sedgefield in County Durham, as it has helped Deanbank Primary School support some of the most disadvantaged students in the North East. A school where 79% of the students receive free school meals. A school in the area at the centre of the focus of my Left Behind Neighbourhoods all-party parliamentary group. And as it happens, the school I first attended myself. Deanbank School is, as I said, it's the first one I attended. It's based in Sedgefield, in one of the mining communities in my constituency that deserve all the help that they can possibly get to stimulate social mobility and aspiration. As others may be aware, since the National Tutoring Programme was launched, it's brought about 430,000 grade increases, 62,000 additional passes in maths and English. Indeed, as has been noted, Professor Becky Francis, Chair of the Education Endowment Foundation, referred to tutoring as one of the best evidenced interventions we have to support disadvantaged pupils' attainment. Meanwhile, according to Public First data, a projected lifetime earnings boost of £4.34 billion can be ascribed to the National Tutoring Programme, based on the tutoring delivered in the 2 years from 2021-22 and 22-23 of just 660 million. Of course, for all that data does to illuminate education, tutoring is not all about numbers. At the Deanbank Primary School in Forest that I mentioned earlier, 20 pupils have been supported in their maths and English since October last year. This is a tiny primary school where it makes such a difference to their world. They're supported by Action Tutoring, an education charity, hugely supported by the National Tutoring Programme. And the school's deputy head teacher, Will Haynes, has said, after the initial setup period, the children had clearly gotten into it. They came into school all excited, saying, "It's tutoring day today." It's going really well. It's quick. It's easy to set up the laptops each week, and the children look forward to seeing their tutors. In the past, a disadvantaged but rural community like Furry Hill would have struggled to get tutoring support, but thanks to the internet, this is no longer the case. And I thank Action Tutoring and their brilliant volunteers for what they do. Indeed, one of the reasons I'm here today, Mrs. Cummins, is because one of my staff, Douglas Oliver, who's here today, also volunteers with them, and has, therefore massively enlightened my understanding of how important the work is that they do. Action Tutoring's analysis shows that 65% of disadvantaged pupils pass their maths GCSE after attending at least 10 tutoring sessions with the charity. Action Tutoring pupils were nearly 13 percentage points more likely to pass maths GCSE than other disadvantaged pupils nationally. These are significant interventions. I could continue, but what I want to say is Action Tutoring's work is indicative of so much valuable tutoring provided by volunteers and others. We must celebrate this work. I know that pupil premium funding was introduced 14 years ago by a Conservative government working in coalition with the Liberal Democrats. And whilst the government gave something in the order of 400 billion of temporary support through the crisis of 2020 to 2021, it seems to me vital that one small part of that support is renewed as the legacy of the pandemic continues to endure for our youngest people. Of course, the government lives in a time of fiscal pressure following the shock of the pandemic and the illegal war in Ukraine, but we must continue to focus on education outcomes and the investment in our future that they afford us. I hope the Government will look at the future of the National Tutoring Programme as an option after this school year, as much needs to be done to look at how we embed tutoring for all students in the years ahead. This tutoring can be the difference in stimulating aspiration in those furthest away from opportunity, and I would encourage all the possible support that the Government can provide.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It really is a pleasure to serve under your chairship. I look forward to every time I'm here and you're in the chair, and I thank you for being here as well, and always for your fairness. Can I also thank the Honourable Lady for Twickenham for excuse me, for leading today's debate on this issue, a very important issue. As always, Madam Chair, I try to bring, as I do, a Northern Ireland perspective, not one that the Minister has responsibility for, but to perhaps add to this debate and the importance. And I'll give some stats, some of what we've done back home, and hopefully we can share those experiences together for our betterment. I know that the Honourable Lady and her party have done much work on the importance of children's education, specifically in regard to tutoring. And the Honourable Lady has so very well set out the scene today and what she herself and her party espouse and hope to achieve, and the benefits of that. And that's been endorsed by the Honourable Gentleman who has just spoken before me. There is certainly a disparity across the United Kingdom in ensuring children from all backgrounds can take advantage of good educational learning. So it is indeed great to be here to give a very clear Northern Ireland perspective to this debate. The Government set up the National Tutoring Programme in England in response to the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on education, because it had changed the COVID disease and all the 2.5 to 3 years of that. It really did change life for everyone. It provided subsidised small group catch-up teaching and mentoring for pupils impacted by COVID. And it really is crazy to think about that and just reflect back just a few years ago where we were. Madam Chair, how much school young people truly missed out on. And although teachers did their best, and they did do their best, the reality is that this was always going to be a difficult task to handle. So because of that, it was important that we looked at different ways to do that, and government did that, especially with key working parents a way to work as well. The latest report on child poverty figures for Northern Ireland, to get some stats and some perspective if I can, said that some 82,000 children live in absolute poverty. Remembering we have a population of 1.95 million, and these figures will give you the enormity of what we're trying to achieve back home. That is almost 1 in every 5 children, with just under 100,000 children in Northern Ireland living in relative poverty as well. So if you add those two figures together, you've got a sum of 182,000 in absolute or relative poverty, and those figures worry me. These figures not only highlighted the current situation in Northern Ireland, but the need for better one-to-one tutoring provision. And furthermore, just to go back to the point of key working parents, due to them providing, in many cases as they did, essential services, children have had less face-to-face teaching provided at home. So it is likely many suffered due to this too. So there's a combination of things. The Honourable Lady referred to it in her introduction, and the Honourable Gentleman who spoke before, and I know that the Honourable Gentleman for Stoke North, I think it is, will speak afterwards, will do likewise, as will the Shadow. I always look very much forward to the Minister's response, Madam Chair, because he always does try genuinely to encapsulate our fears, concerns and questions in a way that can give some encouragement for us as elected representatives. Funding for Northern Ireland was secured by the Halifax Foundation and by the Charities Aid Foundation as well, that allowed there to be a free online tuition service for children of key workers in Northern Ireland from socially disadvantaged backgrounds and children with special educational needs. Combination of two, parents that are away at work and educational children, those who have special educational needs. It's a massive issue. I realise in all the debates we've had on here, Madam Chair, that the issue of special education needs aren't just things we have in Northern Ireland. We have them everywhere in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. That scheme that the Halifax Foundation and the Charities Aid Foundation sponsored was called the Ask a Tutor scheme. And it really did make a difference, and I thank them for that. Government said that raising attainment for children is at the heart of this government's agenda, and I think that's very, very true. And being able to attain good tutoring services is one thing, Madam Chair, but my concern is that this must be deliverable across the whole of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I'm a passionate believer in the strength of the union, and I believe that everybody in this hall today has a similar disposition and attitude as well. I know the Honourable Gentleman for Stoke North, who spoke at my dinner, association dinner just some 2 weeks ago, spoke about the strength of the union, and he enthralled the audience of true unionists in Northern Ireland and Newton Ards with his words. So I thank him for that there and put it on record. I'm very, very pleased to see him here as well. Whilst it is fully understood that education has evolved, we need to ensure that the initial budget is there to support one-to-one tutoring in our schools. Now, we've got an up and working assembly again. The person in charge of education back home is my colleague Paul Gibbon, MLA, the Minister for Education. And I know him, but I know he will work hard on this issue. But the support also needs to be here from Westminster as well. I'm sure the Minister will give us that encouragement or encouraging words and action as well. One of my staff members, Madam Chair, was tutored through her 4th and 5th year of secondary school for maths, and her sessions at that time were £32 for 1 hour each week. This is almost 8 years ago, so I imagine that they're up at least another £10 to £15, which would make it quite challenging for any person to do that individually. So this could be over £200 per month, depending on how many sessions someone was having. And whilst there are people out there who will be able to afford this, and that's fine, and those are sacrifices that you make, there are those who simply won't be able to, and it's giving consideration to those families which should be made a priority. So that's the thrust of my request in this debate, Madam Chair, and I'm going to conclude now with a final sentence. We all want our young children to grow up and excel through school with the best opportunities possible, and providing one-to-one extra tutoring sessions is definitely an excellent way to do just that. See that physically through the staff in the office and what they've told me. I also see that through the introduction of the Honourable Lady for Twickenham, which you put forward why it's important, and others have added to that, and others will add to that in a minute. So I urge the Minister to engage with the devolved nations to ensure that we can all play a role in improving educational outcomes for all young people in this great United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Isn't it great that we have that union? Isn't it great that we can share those ideas? Isn't it great we can do that for our children? Thank you.
Jonathan Gullis.
Thank you very much, Ms Cummins. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I want to congratulate my the Honourable Lady, the member for Twickenham, for securing this incredibly important debate, and thank, very briefly, if I may, my honourable friend, the member for Strangford, for giving me a plug for why I might have a career in the diplomatic corps in the not-too-distant future, which may come as a shock to many. But I appreciate the fact that he invited me, and obviously it was a pleasure to speak to the fine people of Strangford and surrounding areas to talk about our precious and important union. This, for me, Ms Cummins, is very important. I do refer to my register of interest because I was a school teacher professionally, working both in London and Birmingham before entering this place. My partner is an employee of Teach First, who obviously did analyse elements of the programme, and I think also were involved in delivering some of the tutoring in the earlier days, although she was an employee at that stage. But I think it's important just to make sure the record is clear. The National Tutoring Programme plays a massively important part in making sure that particularly pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds, those who are registered as free school meals and those who are not yet but are technically eligible for that free school meals, do have the academic ability to be able to attain the grades that they deserve to achieve, because for levelling up to mean absolutely anything, it has to be that we get education right. Because in Stoke-on-Trent North, Kids Grove and Talk, I can build every shiny building going. I can bring every new job I can to my area. But if it's kids from Stoke-on-Trent who don't end up in those new high-skilled highways jobs, in those new buildings, or the new homes that we're building in our local area, then what is it all for? And for Stoke-on-Trent, sadly, we've retained for far too long being in the bottom 20% when it comes to academic attainment and achievement. I was ranked by the Office for Students in the past as the 7th worst parliamentary constituency in England for kids going on to higher education. 12% of my entire workforce have no formal qualifications, 8% higher than the national average. And of course, the amount of kids actually achieving level 3-4 qualifications through either A-levels, through college or apprenticeship qualifications, remains, as I say, in that bottom 5th nationwide. That is not something I want to see. And sadly, the city is languished with a disastrous PFI deal that this is not meant to be a party political dig, but was administered under the last Labour government back in 2000. 88 schools trapped in a PFI contract run by the council, where they're seeing huge inflationary increases in their costs, predicted up to potentially £100,000 additional funding having to be found for the annual contributions that need to be made, leading us to be scrambling. And I know the Minister was collared by me in the voting lobbies last night, demanding for more funding, because this goes to the heart of the point that whilst I appreciate the government will point to the pupil premium funding, which is a superb initiative, the reality is, as the chair of the Education Select Committee has said, and I agree with him on this, the money, and as the Honourable Lady referenced and I think directly quoted him, the money simply will not be there. Huge inflationary increases in food costs, in equipment costs, in terms of teacher salaries going up, which the government has in part covered some of those increases, but not total. Also, the additional costs, as I say, to situations like in Stoke-on-Trent, where we have that increase in the PFI contributions due to that inflationary pressure, and again, driven by COVID, driven by Vladimir Putin's illegal and immoral war in Ukraine, means that schools are having to use every penny they can find. And so they will not be able to continue out of their own existing budgets to be able to continue this important scheme because of those pressures that they are faced right now with. And Stoke-on-Trent is exactly the area that this kind of intervention is absolutely necessary and needed. And so I absolutely share my concern that we are potentially going to see at the end of this academic year, the end of the National Tutoring Programme as it being funded currently through additional government support and funding, and actually implore with the Minister and say that I will do everything I can with him to lobby Treasury colleagues to demand that this scheme continues to be going on. Because I will say this, Ms Cummins, for the Prime Minister. Back in the summer of 2022, after the Right Honourable Member for Shafton-on-Avon dropped out of the Conservative Party leadership contest, feels a long time ago, I know, but having supported him due to having mentored me for a long period of time and owing a sense of loyalty to that, and obviously believing him to be a very good man, I met with all the leading other contenders, including now the current Prime Minister. And I will say this, when I sat down in a room with him for the first time, I had a conversation about non-Treasury related matters, and to see the fire behind his eyes when he talks about education was something that inspired me, something that is so important, something that sadly I hadn't heard enough of since the Blair years of education, 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 although I fear that was more slogan and gimmick rather than actual delivery. But still, at least it was actually, most importantly, on the forefront of the education agenda at that time. Yes, I will happily give way to my honourable friend.
Just in terms of the flavour of what he's speaking about, would he agree with me that expenditure should be on focused initiatives like this, as opposed to some of the broader, let's do something that covers everybody, and it covers everybody from middle-income families, high-income families, and it's just a broad sweep across the bottom? These are the focused interventions that government should really be focused on.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention. I completely agree with him. I have huge problems when we have these universal schemes because they're not a benefit if everyone's receiving it, in my personal opinion. The idea of having universal free school meals for every child in primary school, I do think is not a good idea, because why on earth would my children be given access to a free school meal when I myself can afford it? And actually, I'd rather see that funding invested, that additional funding for middle class and higher income parents who can afford it, go into those children from disadvantaged backgrounds to have those well-funded breakfast clubs, but also to be able to make sure that they can invest further in such things as the tutoring programme. And let's not forget, Ms Cummins, the Education Endowment Foundation, their own research says that small group tuition adds 4 months of progress onto a student's lives. I see reports within TES, as of January 2024, they said 390,000 grade improvements, both in English and maths, are attributed to the progress that was made due to the National Tutoring Programme over the previous 2 academic years. That goes to show the importance this scheme has had, particularly for English and maths, and particularly when I think we've still got this archaic system in place that means that you must get a pass in those subjects to be able to do an apprenticeship, yet you wouldn't need that in order to go and do your A-levels. We have this 2-tier system, despite having a major skills shortage in this country. And for talking the talk about making sure that apprenticeships are equal to an A-level, there are these bizarre barriers in place that mean that they're not. And I hope, therefore, that the Minister will take back the idea of abolishing the requirements at the foundation stage in order to allow people to get onto apprenticeships and study then, whilst on those courses, their English and maths, to get them up to grade. Because, of course, any responsible company will want that for their employees, because that will improve the outcomes and productivity of their company as well. So I think it's absolutely vital that, despite the fact that government should be applauded for around 5 million tutoring courses which have begun since the inception of this programme, and the fact that it was bold and brave in going for this, And despite the fact that Randstad, I think, is a dark stain on the department's ability to procure, and actually goes back to the very thing that the Honourable Lady for the member for Twickenham and myself were calling for in those early days, of give the money to the schools and trust the teachers, the head teachers, to deliver in large part this particular programme. The school-led approach is something that I think is a much better system. Why? Because those teachers know who those pupils are. They know their backgrounds, they know their learning needs and supports, they know their parents and have the relationship with them. And of course, the teachers are always willing, and have always been willing, to stay behind after school. But if you tell a teacher for the opportunity to have a little bit more money in their pocket, bearing in mind they work probably double the hours they're actually paid for, I certainly used to do 60 hours a week on the front line as a bare minimum whilst being a head of year, then that could have a huge and positive impact, as well as the many fantastic, smaller focused third sector organisations that, again, have existed around for a long time. So I hope we'll never see a Randstad repeat, because I think that was an utter disaster. But what I was pleased to see is the government was nimble on its feet and had that school-led approach, and giving that money to the schools directly did have a very positive impact, which I saw in my albeit very brief time as the Minister for School Standards between September 2022 and October 2022, which I went on a number of visits and saw schools in the Black Country using that funding, speaking with the pupils themselves, who said without that they wouldn't have had the confidence to put their hand up in their own classroom, to ask teachers questions when they didn't understand what it was that was being taught to them. The National Tutoring Programme gave them that confidence to have sixth formers interacting with those year 7s and 8 pupils who are new to the school, to build that sense of collective responsibility to help and assist one another, and give those important leadership skills to those older pupils to use their lived experience to impart their knowledge that they learned from their excellent and outstanding teachers as well. Goes to show the power of the scheme. So I do hope, as I say, that we'll see that, because the National Audit Office did say back in February 2023 that they expected, in the academic year of 2021-22, it was only 47% of pupils who were disadvantaged were accessing this scheme. And I think that the Honourable Lady for Twickenham, myself and many other members here will be worried about that, because the National Tutoring Programme was designed for disadvantaged pupils, and it should not be, therefore, coming to supplement those parents who could afford private tuition if they needs be. And whilst I want to make sure every child has opportunity, we need to find out from the Minister, and I hope we'll hear, of what the government has done since that report in order to really drive up the amount of disadvantaged pupils to hopefully being that 65% target that was initially given to Randstad as part of the contract, because that is exactly the type of figure that we would want to see. Because I agree with Lee Elliott-Major, who's the Professor of Social Mobility at the University of Exeter, it would be, and I quote, a national travesty if we failed to embed tutoring, end quote, into our core schooling day in, day out. And I think, therefore, we have that responsibility. And I'd also like to ask the Minister, Ms Cummins, Schools Week, as of July 2023, reported there was a £240 million underspend in the tutoring programme over the 2021-22 and the 2022-23 academic year. Can I check, was that money reinvested back into the National Tutoring Programme to help cover with the costs that obviously were going to be rising on schools year in, year out to deal with the tutoring programme? Because that was something I actually requested within the department whilst a minister, for any underspend to go into the next academic year, to give the schools more cover, to give them longer to get the programme up and running, to build more trust with the pupils, to put in things in place. And I think that is really important as well. But my final contribution, Ms Cummins, is simple. If the government doesn't want to go ahead with the National Tutoring Programme as it's currently accepted, then I personally believe there is only one other way we can go forward. And like any other honourable member, I will shamelessly plug my own research paper I did with Onward back in November 2020, which calls for not only an extended school day, which I've long been a supporter of, but actually a shortening of the school holidays over the course of an academic year, reducing that summer holiday from 6 weeks down to 4 weeks. And the reason I believe that is, number one, the cost of childcare is extremely expensive, even more expensive than when I wrote that report. So estimated that that would save the average family £133 per week, based on costs associated, as I say, back in November 2020. This would obviously now have massively increased since then. I appreciate the government's done a lot in the childcare space with the new scheme that my own child, I must confess, is going to benefit from, his 2-year-old, when it comes to the 15 hours free childcare as of April, which we've started the process of getting our code to give to our childcare provider. But of course, the other thing, and the most important thing about this, is that it takes, expected from research that I conducted, around 7 weeks for a disadvantaged pupil at the start of an academic year to finally exceed where they left at the end of the summer of their previous academic year. That's 7 weeks of lost learning where they're not able to accelerate at the same pace of their better off peers, which is simply unfair. And therefore, by reducing that holiday to 4 weeks, and I'm happy to have a 2-week October half-term, which I think would be much better for pupils and for teachers in terms of rest and well-being, as well as trying to spread the cost of school holidays throughout the course of the year much fairer, then that would actually give a better opportunity to those younger people. So there are other ideas in the pipeline, and I have a research paper I will happily send to the Minister to have a look at and tell me what he thinks, because ultimately I think it's the right thing, and I appreciate that multi-academy trusts can, and some do this of their own fruition, but I do think this is something that should be driven nationally as well. So as I say, education is the absolute bedrock to levelling up. It is the bedrock to making sure that life chances can be achieved. I have no fiscal rules when it comes to education, because I personally believe if you shove all the money there, you'll have better outcomes on health, you'll have better outcomes in work, you'll have less on the welfare state needing to use it, you'll have better home ownership, you'll have better wages, you'll have less poverty in our country. Education is absolutely epicentre of that in order for it to be achieved. And therefore, we should be pouring money into this particular sector, because if we get it right, as we have done, with the fact that I've now got 92% of my schools rated good as outstanding compared to the around 60% as they were in 2010. The fact I've now got 75% of my kids reaching the necessary levels in phonics compared to the 53% that when we inherited government back in 2010. Then it goes to show that all those changes and all that hard work can go on to be built onto something more. And I am so passionate about making sure that we get education right. As I say, because for my people that I serve, my masters and mistresses back in Stoke-on-Trent North, Kidsgrove and Talk, my Lord Sugars who will hire me or fire me when it comes to the general election later this year, it is absolutely essential that they have every opportunity to make sure that their children can have the opportunities and the ability to access those high-skilled, high-wage jobs that I'm bringing to my local area to improve their life outcomes, because for Stoke-on-Trent to achieve that levelling up agenda, it all gets driven through the education sector. So please, Minister, we have to keep this tutoring programme on the tracks. And as I say, if you're not, then extended school day and shorter school holidays is the alternative, in my opinion. Thank you very much, Ms Cummins.
Catherine McKinnell.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to serve under you as chair, Ms Cummins. And I would like to thank the Honourable Member for Twickenham for bringing forward this debate on tutoring provision this morning, and for all honourable members who've spoken very passionately on behalf of the children, families and school communities that they represent here in Parliament. I think we all agree the scale of the challenge that many of our children and young people are currently facing is immense. We know that children and families have really struggled with the combined impact of years of reduced investment in our public services, and then compounded by the impact of the pandemic. Indeed, the attainment gap, which many have mentioned, between disadvantaged pupils and their peers has widened across all educational phases since 2019. So any limited progress that has been made in the decade before was wiped out in a couple of years. And I know the Honourable Member for Twickenham highlighted this issue also. We know that what happens outside of the school gates reinforces the impact of what happens inside. The rising levels of child poverty, the cuts to youth services in communities, the dwindling support for children with additional needs. Schools are increasingly themselves becoming the front line, with teachers having to buy food with their own money, washing clothes for families, and the increasing challenge of mental health issues. It's now 4 years since that enormous disruption and lost learning experienced by so many children happened and began during COVID. What was most concerning at that time was the lack of planning for children and the inevitable impacts that it would have. No plan for learning from home in the early days, no plan for ensuring all children had the equipment they needed, no plan for schools, teachers, or how to support children afterwards. So when the classrooms did finally reopen after COVID, it wasn't surprising to anyone that children found it hard to adjust. They'd had little socialisation, interaction, and some had received barely any education at all. I saw the impact of this on my own children. My youngest had only just started school when he found himself back at home, being taught by 2 parents with no teaching experience and with 2 other children to try and teach and support, along with 2 full-time jobs being undertaken from home. It was an incredibly challenging time for families everywhere, and in far too many households, particularly where there was less support available, children paid a very heavy price. So Kevin Collins was commissioned by the government to set out a long-term recovery plan for our children. But Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, as the then Chancellor, opted out. He was simply not willing to make that investment in other people's children. And our country continues to pay a very heavy price for the decision he took then, and we will do for some time to come. As the National Audit Office reported last year, disruption to school during the COVID-19 pandemic led to lost learning for many pupils, particularly disadvantaged children. Left unaddressed, lost learning may lead to increased disadvantage and significant missing future earnings for those affected. As a key measure to address this, the government introduced the National Tutoring Programme, initially provided through tuition partners. But the scheme, as honourable members have referenced, was full of missteps, from a very low uptake at the start to schools really struggling to find the tutors that they needed to deliver the support. Though once the government introduced the school-led tutoring element in September 2021, which the honourable member for Stoke highlighted, there was some success and the take-up was higher. NFER evidence shows where tuition hours were increased, it did lead to better outcomes in maths and English. But crucially, and this has been highlighted also, they found that less than half of pupils selected for tutoring were from disadvantaged backgrounds. And as the match funding requirements kicked in and the government funding went from 75% to 50%, those schools who were trying to make it work and who needed it most found it ever more difficult to deliver it. And this year, many schools, especially those in the poorest areas, have used up almost all of their pupil premium and recovery premium funding to pay for tutors, leaving them little to pay for other interventions, such as enrichment or training. Indeed, the benefits of the scheme risk being undermined by the way it was being delivered because it was poorly targeted, meaning lots of the children who needed this support the most haven't been able to benefit from it. So tutoring wasn't mentioned in the budget earlier this month, so the National Tutoring Programme would seemingly be coming to an end. But it was just a few months ago that the then Schools Minister said that the department had committed from the 2023-24 academic year, tutoring will have been embedded across schools in England. But without a specific budget for tuition, it's assumed, therefore, that schools need to use their main budgets to fund this support. Well, if I just finish my point, absorbing the costs into what is already a shrinking pot. So it would be helpful if the Minister could set out the government's vision for how this programme will look going forward. I was going to say in his response to this debate, but he's welcome to make an intervention now.
I will speak in a moment, Mrs Cummins, of course. But I just wondered if the Honourable Lady is saying that she's committing that in the event of her party coming to government, there would be a separate line item for this programme over and above core school budgets.
That's from Mickey.
So the point I'm putting to the government is how they envisage the future of the National Tutoring Programme, and I'd be grateful if the government would set out its vision for that. I will respond to his point as I deal with it in my speech, but okay.
I was just going to say, again, it's not long until there will be, we don't know exactly when, but there will be a general election at some point in the months to come. And if she's saying that she thinks this is a mistake, I'm just interested to hear the alternative that she is setting out.
So, as I said, I'd be really interested to hear what the government's vision is, given it's committed to ensuring national tutoring is embedded within the school system, what its plan for ensuring that takes place, which is what we will inherit from the government. So I'd be very keen to hear the government's response on this, and I'll set out what Labour's plans are, which I'm going ahead to do, and we'll set out in detail what Labour's costed plans are, and and be very interested to hear how the government thinks it will deliver on that pledge to ensure tutoring is embedded nationally within the school system. The Institute for Fiscal Studies have found that school funding in England is already not increasing as fast as the cost pressures they're facing, and it means that the poorer schools will likely struggle most to find the cash for tutoring. Therefore, it is our most disadvantaged pupils that will miss out. So with access to tutoring seemingly diminishing, What is the Minister's plan to recover the lost learning experience by children, which we still have not yet recovered from? I appreciate the Minister would like to move on to the next Labour government to solve some of these issues, but I would be very interested, and I'm sure listeners would be interested, to hear what the government's plan is for solving these issues, given they are currently in charge. In government, Labour would look at how more tailored support could be most effectively delivered to ensure that children get what they need to achieve at school. Crucially, Labour will also look at a whole range of measures to ensure we close that attainment gap. We know that children's speech and language has really suffered since the pandemic, and this has the potential to affect educational attainment in the much longer term. So Labour has pledged to equip every school with the funding to deliver evidence-based early language interventions to tackle this. We also understand how quality teaching is key to unlocking children's potential. So we would use the funding from ending the tax breaks currently enjoyed by private schools to hire 6,500 more teachers in our state schools, giving every child the teachers they need to benefit from a quality education. We also, I will give way.
Very grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way, and I think it's a totally noble aim to bring more teachers into the system. Of course, the government does do an extensive amount of work through grants for people taking on specifically in certain courses, up to £20,000 in some cases where in science. So can I just ask the Honourable Lady what specifically the Labour plan is for that recruitment of new teachers that the government is currently not doing? Because I have genuinely asked previous shadow ministers, and I want to understand what will be done differently, because bearing in mind this government is giving out tens of thousands of pounds for simply turning up to the training course, let alone then staying on with the levelling up bonus payments in education investment areas. I'd just be keen to hear what that plan looks like.
So I do appreciate the sincerity of the honourable members' wish to talk about the challenge in recruitment and retention, and clearly it is related to this debate today, in the sense of, if we had all the teachers we need, would we need a national tutoring programme? However, Labour has set out quite detailed plans about how it would go about resolving the teacher and recruitment retention crisis. And we continue those conversations with the sector as well to make sure that we ensure the money that is currently spent on bursaries, on incentives, that spending envelope is spent as effectively as possible, because clearly there is a problem. The government is seriously missing its recruitment targets. So we have a whole range of measures, but I don't think it would be appropriate to go into the detail that would be required today on that particular point. But I do recognise the sincerity of the honourable members' challenge in that respect, and recognition of the challenge, and Labour is absolutely determined to meet it. We know how children's mental health is a huge challenge, so we would put a specialist mental health professional in every school, and we would ensure young people have access to that early support. We would also invest in mental health hubs to ensure that young people can access that mental health support where they most need it. And we would also offer free breakfast clubs in every primary school to ensure children have that softer start to the school day, that opportunity to learn, to play, to socialise. And we know the evidence is clear that they increase attainment and attendance. And it will also put money back in parents' pockets and ensure a start to the parents' school day that can help them get to work too. So we recognise there is no one fix to the level of challenge within our current system, but we will focus on not just ensuring a more targeted approach to ensuring the children that need that additional support most do get it, but also that we have this wider network of support for every school community to ensure that every child gets that chance of the best start in life. It's all about Labour's mission to break down the barriers to opportunity, to ensure that every child gets that firm foundation and high quality education that sets them up for life. And because education is a priority for Labour, as it has been under every Labour government, we will put it back at the centre of national life. We'll prioritise our children, schools and families once again.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mrs Cummins, and it's a pleasure to see you in the in the chair, and I'd like to thank the Honourable Lady Member for Twickenham for bringing this important debate today, and for everybody who has taken part. Herself, of course, my honourable friend, the member for Sedgefield, of course, the honourable gentleman from Strangford, who brought his or the Northern Ireland perspective. My honourable friend for Stoke-on-Trent North, and of course the lady who speaks for the opposition, the honourable member for Newcastle upon Tyne North. She spoke of rightly, of the hard times of COVID, and we all remember those times from our own home experiences as well as our professional experiences. They were indeed very difficult. They were also very difficult to plan for, because it was an experience that our country and indeed other countries had not had before. I don't think it's right to say that people were slow to react. I think, for example, with what happened on Oak National Academy, I thought that was an amazing thing that came together quickly. I think the work that teachers did, head teachers did, in converting to virtual education and being able to learn from home, I thought again was a remarkable effort, but there is no doubt that it was an incredibly hard time. International studies like PISA show that the whole world took a really big knock from COVID. I mean, with very, very few exceptions. There are one or two jurisdictions in the world, but almost every country took a serious hit in education attainment from COVID. England held up relatively well, and that's part of why in the most recent PISA results, for example, in mathematics, England was ranked 11th in the world, which was an improvement in rankings on recent times, but particularly so looking back to the period before 2010 when England had been ranked 27th. So from 27th to 11th. And also we saw improvements in reading and in science. And in the Pearls 2021 primary study, of course, England primary school readers in England were fourth in the world, first in the Western world. But none of that changes the fact that COVID was a terrible knock to education here and elsewhere in the world, and differentially, of course, to different families, to different groups of children. And would you let me sort of get going, and then, of course, of course, go ahead.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way, because I know he and his other colleagues talk a lot about the PISA scores, and obviously we can't deny that evidence in front of us. And he talked about the impact of the pandemic, but does he recognise that the attainment gap, which had been starting to dwindle, as I pointed out, about the pupil premium, and I noticed he smarted about the fact that it was a Liberal Democrat commitment that we delivered with the Conservatives, with the Conservative government. That wasn't the political point I was wishing to make. The point I was wishing to make was, will he recognise that the attainment gap was actually starting to widen again before the pandemic, and that the pandemic has accelerated that further? And that is really what I think all of us are here to try and talk about and tackle today through the tutoring programme.
Minister.
Well, Mrs Cummings, let's not pursue the thing about the pupil premium. That happened to be in both Conservative and Liberal Democrat plans for government ahead of 2010. I think the two parties worked together in coalition well, and I think that's a good thing which we should welcome. There had been progress on the disadvantaged gap. It is also true, as I was just saying, that COVID, hit the whole world, but it also has hit different groups of children differentially, and we are still seeing the effects of some of that now in terms of the disadvantaged gap. And I will come back to that further as well. Mrs Cummings, as I was saying, tutoring has been a key part of our recovery plan, and I want to thank everybody who's been involved in that. The tutors, obviously the tutoring organisations, the teachers and teaching assistants and everybody else who has made it possible. And our honourable friend from Sedgefield mentioned, of course, the particular role and contribution of volunteers, and I absolutely join him in that. It's a very special thing to do. And the tutoring, as I say, in the National Tutoring Programme is not necessarily always the tutoring that comes to mind when the person in the street thinks of tutoring. A lot of it, as the Honourable Lady alluded to, has been small group work, and it's not just one-to-one. And although there has been very important work done by outside tutoring organisations, actually most of the work in the National Tutoring Programme has been done by existing school staff in school. And we've committed £1.4 billion for the 4-year life of the programme in schools and colleges through the National Tutoring Programme in schools, and also the 16 to 19 tuition fund for that age group. And for the second year of the programme, and my honourable friend from Stoke-on-Trent North referred to this, funding has gone direct to schools, and that has enabled schools to choose what's the right approach for them and for their children, either to use their own staff or quality assured tuition partners, or to employ an academic mentor. We created the Find a Tuition Partner service to put schools in touch with those opportunities, and also provided training through the Education Development Trust for staff, including teaching assistants who would be delivering that tutoring. And nearly 5 million courses have been started since the NTP launch in November 2020, and 46% of the pupils tutored last year were eligible, or had been eligible for free school meals, what we call the Ever 6 measure, had been eligible for free school meals in the past 6 years, a measure of disadvantage. And the 16 to 19 tuition fund will also have achieved hundreds of thousands of courses. So the tutoring programme has been part of the wider £5 billion education recovery funding, which is made up of the £1.4 billion for tutoring, £400 million for aspects of teacher training, £800 million for additional time in 16 to 19, and nearly £2 billion direct to schools for evidence-based interventions appropriate for pupils' needs. And the Honourable Lady opposite rightly mentioned speech and language interventions. I can tell her that already 2/3 of primary schools have benefited from our investment in the Nuffield Early Language Intervention Programme, 211,000 Year R children so far. And the evidence around that programme suggests that it can make 4 months of additional progress, and a greater amount, 7 months, for free school meal eligible children. So, as I say, COVID hit the world, and it hit us too. Didn't hit every discipline in exactly the same way. Reading, actually, and some of us will recognise this from our own time at home with children. Some things were easier to get them to carry on doing than others. Reading actually has held up pretty well through COVID. Maths has now, I'm talking about at Key Stage 2 in junior school. Maths has now been improving and is close to the years before COVID. Writing still behind, although we have had a 2 percentage point improvement since last year. And look, big challenges do remain, Mrs. Cummins, no one denies that. Number one actually is attendance, and there is an obvious link between being, I mean, it almost sounds trite to say it, being at school and the attainment that you will get from being at school. But it does bear repeating that when you have, if you have difficulties in having as many children in school, that is, we really have to work on attendance. But as well as the overall attainment effect of attendance, there is also a differential attendance factor between the cohort of pupils as a whole and disadvantaged pupils. In other words, there is a bit more absence in the latter group than the former. So there is also quite a link, and some studies say it's actually a really big part of the link between that on attendance and the attainment gap, which makes it doubly important that we work on attendance. And there are many things, as colleagues will know, many things going on that schools are doing brilliantly, and indeed local authorities and others are doing brilliantly to try and work on work on getting attendance back up to pre-COVID levels. Obviously, every child needs to be off school sometime because of sickness. All of us were when we were children, and that will always be true. But we need to get back to those kinds of levels that we had before COVID. The Honourable Lady alluded to some of the specific things that we do around breakfast clubs. We think actually it's important to do that in a targeted way, to do it in secondary school, not just in primary school, as the Labour Party plan. There are issues around mental health support as well. That's why we're rolling out the mental health support teams gradually across the country. But again, we think that's right to have in both phases. It's important actually in primary school as well as secondary school. And then overall, there's the immense amount of work that schools themselves are doing. On tutoring, whilst the national tutoring programme was always a time-limited programme post-COVID, tutoring will continue to play an important role. And we know that the evidence shows that tutoring is an effective, targeted approach to increase attainment of pupils. Now, head teachers are the best placed people to decide how to invest their funding depending on their particular circumstances and their particular priorities, and that approach really underpins our whole approach to the school system, that we shouldn't be that we make head teachers in charge. But for many schools, I do anticipate them continuing to make those tutoring opportunities available to their pupils, and we'll continue to support schools to deliver tutoring into the future, including through the pupil premium funding, which will rise to over £2.9 billion in 24-25. Now, as I say, schools decide how to use their funding, aided by the EEF, Education Endowment Foundation, which sets out very good knowledge, good advice on best uses of funding, the education programmes with the most efficacy attached to them. And I don't think there is a conflict between universal programmes and highly targeted programmes. We think that you target via the funding formula, and then head teachers are best placed, as I say, armed with this knowledge from the EEF and others, decide how to use that funding. And we do. Just let me finish this one sentence, and then, of course, there is the disadvantage element in the overall national funding formula, and that for next year will be a bigger proportion of the overall national funding formula than previously. And then, of course, there is the pupil premium. My honourable friend.
Thank you very much. Ms Cummins, thank you to my right friend for giving way. Obviously, I've outlined in detail already why I think schools need this additional funding due to the financial pressures they're under. But if the government's not seeking to do that, and I personally think that's a mistake, if the government chooses not to do that, which way is the Department for Education planning to somehow monitor how many schools continue to deliver tutoring and what percentage of pupils are disadvantaged? Or is the Department of Education simply not going to keep an eye on the ball post the ending of this funding and just rely, as the Minister has rightly said, on head teachers who will do the things in the best interest of their pupils, but ultimately will leave us without less knowledge in this place about spending decisions that are being made as to whether or not that type of support is continuing and embedded, as was the aim when initially this was introduced.
And look, it is absolutely appropriate to embed tutoring into schools' wider programmes, because we know from the EEF, and other studies, by the way, but particularly from the EEF, which is our gold standard analyser, we know that it's an approach. Obviously, it depends how you do it and all the rest of it, but it is an approach which does have efficacy, does have results attached to it. And yes, we will, as my honourable friend puts it, we will of course keep an eye on it. But that's not the same as specifying that, you know, if your head Mrs. Smith, that you should do that, but not that. We think that Mrs. Smith, the head teacher, should be able to decide. And of course, we have Ofsted inspections and we have publication of results to have a very transparent system, but a transparent system in which schools themselves, school leaders, trusts are empowered to make those decisions. Honourable Lady.
Munira Wilson.
Look, I completely agree with him about giving head teachers and teachers autonomy. You know, as a Liberal, I don't believe in things being controlled from the centre. They know best. But the reality of the funding situation, as the Honourable Member for Stoke-on-Trent North has pointed out, is that many schools, for the first time ever, are now setting deficit budgets. Whilst we can talk about in cash terms money has gone up, we know that in real terms, look, the Institute for Fiscal Studies has talked about how schools' spending power has massively been reduced by inflationary costs. I pointed out that the pupil premium in real terms has been cut by 14%. The reason why the tutoring fund was underspent was because they can't even match fund so many of the schools, the funding that is available. So the reality is, if the Minister really believes this is an effective, evidence-based intervention to make, schools are not going to be able to continue it without the ring-fence dedicated funding. And I heard that at Southwark College myself last year when I went to visit, and they are dealing with some of the most disadvantaged pupils who otherwise are going to have no life chances at all if they don't get that support they need.
Minister.
Thank you, Mrs Cummins. On the subject of funding, look, including pupil premium and the recently announced additional amounts for covering pension contributions, overall school funding next year will be £2.9 billion higher than 23-24, and will take the total to over £60 billion in 2024-25, which is the highest ever level in real terms per pupil. And in 16 to 19, we also remain committed to improving outcomes for students, particularly those yet to achieve their GCSE English and Maths. And obviously, I know this is a subject that came up earlier. I should stress, by the way, that there isn't an impediment to starting an apprenticeship from not having English Maths. You just have to continue to study it while doing that apprenticeship. And there is, I just would say, I know this is a subject which stirs strong feelings in many people. I would just say that we know that the workplace value and the life value of English and Maths is immense, and that is why there is so much focus on English and Maths. And as we come to develop the Advanced British Standard, the ABS, but also in what we did in designing T-levels, as well as some of these reforms around apprenticeship, yes, English and Maths are so important for the futures of these young people. And that's why in October we announced an additional £300 million over 2 years to support students who do need to resit their GCSEs. Colleagues will know, of course, that there isn't a rule that everybody has to resit a GCSE. It depends on the grade that you have first time around in GCSEs, whether it is GCSE mathematics that you will resit, or whether you take a functional skills qualification instead. And the £300 million is part of what we call an initial down payment on the development of the Advanced British Standard, which, as colleagues will know, will be a new baccalaureate-style qualification, taking the best of A-levels and T-levels and bringing them together into a single qualification and ending that artificial distinction between academic and vocational for good. Mrs Cummins, again, I'm grateful to the honourable member for bringing this debate today. And again, I'm very, very grateful to everybody who has been involved, continues to be involved in the National Tutoring Programme and in the 16 to 19 programme. Tutoring can have a transformational effect on attainment of pupils and students, and I'm proud of the department's flagship tutoring programmes that have been supporting so many in catch-up following COVID-19. So in closing, I simply repeat my thanks to everybody who's taken part in this debate today, and to all the schools and colleges that have participated in these programmes, all the tutors, including the volunteer tutors who have delivered it, and of course all the pupils and the students for engaging so enthusiastically.
Munira Wilson to wind up.
Thank you, Chair. Can I start where the Minister ended with also extending my thanks to all those involved in the tutoring programme, particularly volunteers, and Douglas, who's here today as well, who was name-checked earlier from the Office of the Honourable Member for Sedgefield. The contribution they've made, and that our teachers, who work extraordinarily hard day in, day out, make to our children is just invaluable. So thank you to all of them, and thank you to all the members who did turn up today to participate in this. As I say, I know there are many other honourable members who couldn't be here today who are very strongly committed to the tutoring programme. The Honourable Member for Sedgefield talked about the excitement that pupils often experience when they're receiving tutoring, and that goes to the point that I made around tackling persistent absence, and we know that tutoring helps actually bring down some of those absence levels. And the Honourable Member for Strangford talked about the importance of extending these sorts of programmes right across our 4 nations, given the benefits involved. And I think this is a first for me to say that I strongly agree with the Honourable Member for Stoke-on-Trent North. It's not very often I find myself saying that, but I think where I'm in violent agreement with him, and it's something that I and the Liberal Democrats constantly point out, is we as a party see money spent on education and our children and young people as an investment, as a long-term investment. And I'm afraid that the Treasury often sees children as a cost, and we need to see them as they're part of our current society, but also our future society and our economy. And investing heavily early on will pay dividends and generate returns for generations to come. And as he pointed out, levelling up starts here with children. And that's why I'm so perplexed as to why the government isn't extending this programme. I know the Minister said it was time limited to start with, but given the attainment gap continues to grow and given the evidence that's been generated to show the impact, I'm slightly surprised that we aren't seeing a continuing commitment to it. And if I may say so, I was disappointed that following persistent questioning by the Minister, we didn't hear any commitment from the Labour front bench to continue tutoring. Should there be a well, we know there will be a general election, but should there be a change of government later this year or at the start of next year? Because again, it speaks, tutoring really does help to tackle that attainment gap. And I just repeat my point to the Minister. I know he said that it's a great intervention, but without the money, we know that too many children now, more children are going to be left behind. So I urge him again, even if he may not have said so publicly right now, to please go away and talk to the Treasury about whether they can find some money to continue this important intervention, because our children really do deserve the very best start in life, and we can't just keep writing off those who don't have the same advantages as many of us. And I speak as a parent who has invested in tutoring for my daughter. I want the child down the road who lives, in much more challenging conditions, who doesn't necessarily have the support at home, to have that same benefit that my daughter does, so that they can achieve great things, because every child has that potential. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered tutoring provision. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order.